Hi, welcome to History Through Fiction, the podcast. I'm your host, Colin Mustful, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Meagan Church, author of The Mad Wife. Meagan, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Of course. Well, let's just start with the main character, the Mad Wife, Lulu Mayfield. Who is she, and what's the story around her?
Yeah, so a nice little elevator pitch for the book is basically that the Mad Wife is a rebuttal of that sort of romanticized notion of the 1950s housewife. And it just takes a close examination of the era of hysteria and is really reminiscent of Sylvia Plath, both her work, her fiction, The Bell Jar, but also her life itself. And so we examine this world through Lulu Mayfield's eyes, like literally, because this is first person perspective. And so it really is just a very immersive story of examining this 1950s housewife who should be living that ideal American suburban life. But after the birth of her second child, she can't quite find herself content and happy. And then she becomes fixated on a new neighbor who moves in across the street named Bitsy. But it's really Lulu's examination of trying to understand Bitsy, who seems a little too perfect on the outside. And Lulu thinks there's something lurking, behind her smile. And she wants to get to the bottom of what that is. But the more she digs into Bitsy, the more repressed memories start coming to the surface for Lulu herself. And so it's really an examination of where the lines of reality and delusion blur.
You mentioned the word hysteria. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the meaning of that word because we're talking now in 2025. This takes place in the early 1950s. Did it take on a different connotation, a different actual meaning? Was it weaponized in some way?
Yeah, so hysteria, when we think of using that term colloquially, we can say, well, that was hysterical, as in that was really funny. But as you dig into really the root word of hysteria, it's the same root as hysterectomy because the root of hysteria is uterus. And what really fascinated me as I started digging into when hysteria was a medical diagnosis was understanding like the history of it. So until 1980, hysteria was a psychological diagnosis. But at first, it was classified as a physical condition. And this was really what blew my mind and got me so interested in this idea because the ancient Egyptians and Greeks, they referred to it as the wandering womb, where they believed that if a woman was out of sorts, it was because her uterus was migrating within her body. And the cure was to basically try to coax it back into right position. Now, this was before they did autopsies and understood what was going on internally, and that a womb couldn't simply wander through the body. But even after the autopsies and even after they realized it was not this physical condition that they thought it was, it was still that psychological condition. And it became a catch-all diagnosis that was often dismissive of women. And it meant that conditions such as depression, anxiety, postpartum depression and psychosis, even lupus or rheumatoid arthritis or multiple sclerosis and more went undiagnosed because this was in a time when a lot of these conditions were not understood on women's bodies because it was not until 1993 when Bill Clinton signed into law that NIH funded studies had to be equally done on women's bodies and men's bodies. And so that was when we started learning more about how some of these conditions presented for women. And so in Lulu's era, doctors would treat these hysterical patients, most often women, with things like mild tranquilizers such as Miltown or psychoanalysis, or it could be psychiatric hospitalization or electroconvulsion therapy or even lobotomy.
So you're talking about some very important issues that need to be out front and talked about. But at the same time, you've written a very compelling novel and entertaining story. Can you talk about your character, the vehicle you use to tell the story in Lulu,
Mhm.
and how you're able to combine those elements of confronting these important issues while entertaining the reader with a psychological thriller.
Yeah. Yeah. So my agent will probably be embarrassed to know that I'm going to use this analogy because it was hers. And she's ashamed of herself for this, but really it was what I needed in the writing of this because we called it the broccoli and the cheese, right? Of the nutrition of the broccoli, but the tastiness of the cheese that actually takes away the nutrition. But it was finding that balance between being able to tell this story, that has these historical roots and has these long-term consequences on women's health care, mental health, and physical health as well. But to do it in a way that made for a compelling read. Well, honestly, a big source of inspiration for this book is Sylvia Plath's book, The Bell Jar. And my daughter, who was 15 at the time, wanted to read The Bell Jar, and she did read it, and she enjoyed it, but not as much as I hoped she would, because she didn't find it immersive. And I began to ask that question of how could I tell a similar story? It's not the same story. Lulu deals with different things than Esther Greenwood of The Bell Jar did, but how can I tell a similar type of story, but do it in a way that the modern reader would find more immersive and compelling? And so it was finding that mix of that broccoli and that cheese to really, you know, be in a sense exploring history, but not make it feel like you're reading a textbook on hysteria and lobotomy and electroconvulsion therapy and all of that. So to do it through the eyes of a character that hopefully the readers want to go along on her journey and explore what she's up to.
Can you talk a little bit more about the history? We're here at History Through Fiction. We publish historical novels, and I'm always curious to know about the process of research. You've already shown that you are very well versed in the psychological language and diagnoses. What about also the historical setting, the circumstances, getting those things right? What was that research like, and how were you able to convey that authentically in the novel?
Yeah. So, as I said, some of the research started with the bell jar. Well, honestly, I need to back up to some of the initial sparks of the idea of this started as I was finishing up my previous book, The Girls We Sent Away, which is set in the mid 60s. And so similar sort of, post-war era. And there were two things that I came across in writing that book that just kept kind of sticking to my brain for some reason. And that was one of the characters in The Girls We Sent Away listens to the Rolling Stones, and the Rolling Stones have this song called Mother's Little Helper, which is basically about a mild tranquilizer. And I just became fascinated by the song and the idea, exploring, what that meant as those mild tranquilizers made it to market and became very commonplace for bored housewives. And then the other part of that previous book that inspired this one was Jello salads, because there's a Jello salad that I mentioned in The Girls We Sent Away. And then I went down this rabbit hole of looking at all of these molded foods and Jello salads that were huge in that post-war era. And even just looking at old recipe books and things like that started to put me more into the 1950s mindset. But, from there, it was reading The Bell Jar, which was written, I believe it was 1959. So, right there in that same era. I turned to YouTube. Honestly, YouTube was a huge and surprising resource for me on this one because I could go watch videos from the era, or this was especially fascinating. Not, this would not happen today due to HIPAA laws, but you can actually find videos on YouTube of women having therapy sessions with their psychiatrist. And so that also helped put me in both the era and the mindset of these women who were labeled hysterical and were sent away to, mental institutions. And you can hear them describing what their experiences are. You can, I mean, even to see their body language, to see sometimes how they were disconnected or speaking about very emotional things, but with no emotion because they were so detached. And so those sorts of things really just helped put me in that mindset of both the character and the era, along with countless podcasts that I listened to, articles. I discovered that Sylvia Plath was inspired by a Cosmo article called Psychiatry and Beauty from 1959. I was able to read that and again kind of hopefully immerse myself in a similar sort of mindset as what she had when she was writing The Bell Jar. And there is Lulu within the Madwife, she likes to collect green stamps, those loyalty customer stamps. S&H green stamps was one of the brands. So I ordered one of those old catalogs off eBay and some of the stamps so I could feel them and I could really see what the color was and the texture and things like that. And just flipping through that catalog, again, just helped me imagine what some of the decor pieces would be that Lulu would be filling her house with too.
Well, that's remarkable, the primary source material that you had access to, and
Mhm.
frightening a little bit, but yeah, quite remarkable. And don't knock Jello salads. I'm not sure you were, but I love a good Jello salad. So,
Listen, there are some good Jello salads. My grandmother made red Jello salad. I think she used cherry and she'd put bananas in it, and I loved this. But there were Jello salads with things like tuna. There's one, yes, there is one referenced in the book called Perfection Salad that has radishes and celery and carrots. That's where I draw the line with Jello salad. It can be sweet, but there is no savory going into a Jello for me.
wow, radishes. I can't imagine, or tuna. Ugh.
No, 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 no.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about what you write about because you brought it up in a recent blog post that these aren't easy topics, and your previous novels as well. Um, Talk about why you chose, or maybe what led you down that path of writing about these subjects, and why it's so valuable to bring them out through historical fiction.
Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that question because I really do enjoy talking about this because I'll be honest, I never set out to write historical fiction. Everything I wrote was modern and contemporary. My degree is English with a concentration in creative writing. All of my short stories as an undergrad, all of my work up until my debut novel was modern and contemporary. But unfortunately, I had a personal connection to that first idea that threw me into the historical genre. That's because my first book, The Last Carolina Girl, has to do with eugenics and forced sterilization and a 14-year-old orphan who's fighting for her future in that era. And that personal side of the story is that I discovered a great aunt of mine had been sterilized by the state of Indiana when she was around the age of 12. Now, we did not know this until after she passed away at the age of 92. And so I was trying to make sense of how did this happen? How was this ever legal? What even was eugenics? And that just threw me down a rabbit hole of research that resulted in The Last Carolina Girl. And then from there, when I finished up that draft and I was in the long and arduous stage of querying agents, I knew I needed to get to work on the next one. And I was watching The Handmaid's Tale. Season one ended. I was trying to make sense of it. And I saw a reviewer said something about if you don't believe this could happen today, you need to look at the baby scoop era. So that threw me down a new rabbit hole of research of exploring maternity homes. That one is set at the intersection of the space race and the baby scoop era in the mid 1960s. And then with this one, with the 1950s and hysteria, it's just, I found myself, my husband always knows when I'm onto a new idea because I start getting irritated. And I just don't stop talking about a subject because it's really getting under my skin. And so, with all three of these stories, it's been an opportunity to look through the eyes of what I have come to call the every woman. We know the every man stories, right? Those were the stories I was obsessed with when I graduated college and I could finally read whatever I wanted to, and it didn't need to be British literature anymore. And so I was really digging into Salinger and Hemingway and Updike and reading those everyman stories. But what I attempt to do with my fiction is explore the every woman stories. And with these three, it's also done through that historical lens because I want to see, through practices that have happened within our past and in not so distant past as well, what what would an average woman who was thrown into that historical context, what would her life have been like? Because really, to me, one of the most amazing benefits of both reading and writing is growing more empathetic. Studies are showing that reading literary fiction increases empathy in your real life because it's called theory of mind. You are spending time seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, of standing in their shoes, of being inside their minds, and then that actually affects how you are in your real life as well. And so I've just seen this opportunity to tell these stories that hopefully are full of empathy and nuance as well, of the good and the bad of human nature, and the chaos that it creates, and the dichotomy within each character as well. But hopefully, my readers, as they spend time in these stories and other stories, not just mine, but other stories, that then they can better empathize in real life. Because again, we're looking at this every woman, this average person who's just simply trying to live her life, but she then comes up against whether it's sterilization or maternity homes or this blanket diagnosis of hysteria. And then it's the question of what voice does she have? What agency or autonomy does she have to fight for her future?
Can we talk a little bit about women today? Because you talk about all these issues that happened here in the 50s and the 30s, and uh, now today we're still having the debate, and some would argue that there's been some dangerous rollbacks to women's rights and women's health care. Um, what do you think about where we're at and where the conversation should be headed, and how your stories help highlight the importance of those conversations?
Yeah, it's been really interesting writing historical fiction, and none of these books did I believe would be timely at the time that I was writing them, but by the time they've hit the market, they have become a lot more timely as into what our conversation as a society is. And these are important stories, and part of what I do is look back and examine the somebody within society who was pushed to the margins, right? And was society working for them in that regard? And I think that's a question we need to continue to ask. Who is it that is on the margins right now? Who are we overlooking? Who are we not seeing? Who are we not hearing? What voices are not being heard? And that's really that common thread through all of these books, is who is going unnoticed right now? And that's a question. It's a big question at the moment, because I think there are a lot of groups of people who are not being noticed. And we need to hear story. We need to be reminded of our history, because Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And so I think the more we come to understand our history and come to terms with it, the better we can do moving forward, so that our present does not rhyme with these practices of our past. And it's just really, Ruth Bader Ginsburg said that she was asked, where do women belong? And she said something to the effect of, I'm sure this is not a direct quote, but it was something to the effect of, women belong in all of the rooms where the decisions are being made. And I would say that I truly very much believe that. And there are things happening right now that are removing us from those rooms. As I referenced, as far as hysteria is concerned, and the law that Bill Clinton signed in 1993 about the NIH funded studies studying equally men and women. And now we can look at grant applications that are not being accepted if they have keywords such as women in them. And so it has taken us, we are centuries behind on studying women's bodies. We were starting to make progress on that over the last, what is that, 20, 30 years? But now, if that's going to pause, we are going to lose so much traction. And there is so much knowledge that we need to be learning right now and making up for last lost time, let alone advancing into the future. That is really
Well, let's shift gears.
okay.
We haven't, we started obviously talking about your novel, The Mad Wife, but we got into so many interesting and vital topics. So, first of all, I want to say thank you just for being honest and open and having that conversation about those things. But now I want to shift to you as a writer, as an author, as a teacher. You already mentioned that you have an education in English and writing. Um, what about the process for you of getting to this point of releasing this traditionally published book, of being an agented author? What has that whole path been like for you?
What has the path been like? Long and winding. That is what the path has been like. When I graduated college, a while ago, let's just say it that way, I thought I would sit down and write the great American novel and I would be off with my life as a published author. But I got married very young. I was still in college when I got married. So when I graduated, I had a marriage and a mortgage and I needed to help pay the bills, right? So I went to work in an advertising agency. And on the one hand, I thought, I'm getting paid to be a writer. This is amazing. But focusing on the copywriting and the marketing and the public relations and advertising words meant that it was difficult to carve out time for the fiction, which is where my heart has always been. But I kept doing what I could. I kept moving forward. I wrote two practice novels that will never ever see the light of day, but they were necessary because as I briefly mentioned before, I wrote short stories in college because that's all you have time to write as an undergrad. You don't have time to explore how to tell a full-length book. And telling a full-length book is a very different task than a short story, and it takes a lot of practice and a lot of study to figure out how to do that. And so it took me about 20 years longer to become a published author than I thought it would. Uh, and it is, my kids are, my oldest is 18. I have an 18, 16, and 13-year-old. They have been along on this journey with me because my debut released in 2023. So they saw the blood, sweat, and tears. They heard the stories of the rejection of finding an agent and the anxiety of going out on submission to publishers and, wondering if an editor is going to choose to acquire your book. And while I had hoped to be more established at a younger age, it's really been a benefit for them to see this journey that it takes to accomplish something. A lot of times people will say, "Oh my goodness, your dream came true." And I just think to myself that this is the most difficult dream I've ever had because it requires so much work and so much not giving up and not letting the rejection, whether it's self-criticism or outside, to get to you, to choose to keep going forward, and to hope that someday somebody other than just your mother is going to take the time to read the stories that you've written. And so my writing professor always said, the key to publishing is perseverance, and it's true. And it's perseverance in so many different aspects, whether it's persevering through a story idea that you think might have potential, but you're not sure. And do you actively pursue that or not? But then you have to pursue and persevere through revisions and through finding an agent and through, that submission process with editors. And then you have to go through the editing process there and the marketing process. And then your book goes out to market, and then it's open to Goodreads and Amazon reviews and all those places too. But you just have to keep persevering and going and just telling those stories that you want the world to hear.
It's definitely a great message for anyone who's working on a manuscript or has a story idea. So thank you so much for sharing that from where you were to where you are now. I think that's great to hear. You did talk about working with an editor. Will an editor like it? Working through revisions, but I see you also work as an editor and offer editing services. Can you talk about maybe first why you go beyond just being a writer to being an editor, and how you're able to use your experience as a writer to be a better editor?
Yeah, absolutely. I do editorial assessments and developmental edits, as well as a limited amount of story coaching. And I'm adjunct faculty at Drexel University as part of their MFA program. I'm basically paired with one of their MFA students, and work is kind of like a guide or an editorial role one-on-one with her. And I believe that literary citizenship is a good and necessary thing. And this is part of how I can contribute to that literary world is by taking my experiences and just helping guide and hopefully offering something of use to an author, a writer who is trying to figure out, what that story is that they want to tell and how to go about it too. I don't have all of the right and wrong answers because there's very few things in writing and publishing that is black and white and concrete. What I do a lot of times is I think I should actually start calling myself a story therapist because it's really more about asking questions of the author to help them unlock, those things that they need to figure out what that story is and who the character is and how to tell it. But it really it selfishly also helps me because when I am challenged to read a manuscript and give constructive criticism and feedback that I hope will help strengthen their manuscript, then it causes me to continue to study into story structure and reading more on the craft and all of that kind of stuff so that I can provide those resources for writers too. And so it also just helps me in further developing my own craft by working along other writers.
That's an excellent point. I find myself reading books of craft just so I can articulate to writers, this is what I mean, this is why I mean it.
Yes, I love to hear that. I'm glad I'm not alone in that. So yes.
I see a typewriter behind you. Do you use it or is that just for decor?
It is just decor. Yes, I'm starting a small collection of typewriters. Nothing too extravagant right now. The first one was given to me. It was my husband's grandmother's typewriter, and my mother-in-law gifted it to me. And then the one behind me was I found it in an antique mall, and I was like, "Oh, this needs to come into my office." And so I like the aesthetic, but I'm very thankful that I can work on a laptop instead of trying to type things out on those keys and without, backspace and delete and, all of the conveniences that we writers have now.
Sure. Yeah, I never got into using a typewriter, but my father did. He had an interesting chair where you kind of sit on your knees. I can remember him just clacking away at
Uh-huh.
that. I don't know if he still has it, but um, yeah, it looks really nice behind you. Looks like you have a very nice office, in fact.
Thank you.
Well, what's next? I mean, this obviously you are doing some marketing and pre-publicity for the Mad Wife. Are you have another project that you're working on? What are you thinking ahead after the release of the Mad Wife?
Yeah, so I do have a work in progress. It is a little bit of a secret at the moment because I'm giving myself freedom. I'm not under contract with this one, which both is has freedom but also anxiety attached to it. But the reason I really want to work outside the bounds of a contract right now is because it's different. It's not historical. It is modern and contemporary. And it's basically a story asking the question of if a woman in that sandwich period of her life of helping an ailing parent while also raising angsty teenagers, if she is allowed to have a midlife crisis at that point in her life. And so it's something, it's a bit of a change, but I think that the character study is the similarity between my first three and this one. And it's just been a fun project to mix things up and to challenge myself to write something that's just a little bit different than what I've done before.
Well, Megan, congratulations on the Mad Wife. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. Thank you so much for just confronting these kinds of issues and to finding a way to bring it to readers that where they can empathize. So, once again, congratulations and thanks so much for talking with me about the Mad Wife.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's been fun.